Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Sanhedrin Daf Lamed Vav. Today's stuff is sponsored by Becky Goldstein in loving memory of her father, Cantor Yoel ben Meir Frum, a lone survivor who served his Kila in Canada devotedly. His advice to me, spiced with midrashim, encouraged my learning and independent thinking. Grandchildren are his legacy. I miss his nigunim and stories. He was my guiding light. Okay, we're going to get started right now with a review of the last part of what we did yesterday. Okay, we had a lot of Kal Vachomer arguments that were kind of confusing. Again, if you think of just in a sense of a hierarchy, what's more important than what, and then it would be kind of transitive property. If this doesn't override that, then that can't override that. Okay, so we had Abaye who basically suggested, if you remember, what we understood in the end was that Ritzicha is not doche Shabbat or Yom Tov, which means that if you're supposed to be killed on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and that was really where this whole discussion started, we can't, if you're supposed to be killed by the court, right? Ritzicha doesn't really mean murder. It means we're supposed to kill someone by court order. We don't implement that on Shabbat. So comes Abaye, and Abaye suggests a Kal Vachomer, which he says, based on the fact that Ritzicha does not override Shabbat, then Ritzicha should not override the temple worship because, right, what do we learn? Temple worship is more important than Shabbat because you do it on Shabbat. And then Shabbat is not overridden by Ritzicha. So in order you have ritual worship, right, temple worship, then Shabbat, and then you have Ritzicha because Ritzicha doesn't override Shabbat. So how could it possibly override what's stronger than Shabbat, which is Avodah? Now, why do we think Ritzicha does override Avodah? Well, the pasuk says so. The pasuk says, "Me'im is v'chiti kachenu lamut," right? And the whole context there was, if there's a murderer, we take the murderer out of the temple, and we give him the punishment, even though he might be a kohen in the middle of his work at the temple. So what did Abaye say to resolve that? Abaye said, oh, maybe that pasuk is only relating to work in the temple that does not override Shabbat, because there is such a thing. What is that? Well, on Shabbat, the only sacrifices you can bring are communal sacrifices, not individual sacrifices. So Abaye said, let's say that pasuk applies to individual sacrifices. If a Kohen is working on individual sacrifices, pull him out of the temple to kill him. But if he's working on communal sacrifices, since they override Shabbat, and taking him out to kill him doesn't override Shabbat, then very simply, we shouldn't be taking him out of the temple because the temple worship is obviously higher and more important than that. Now, Rava says, no way, no how. And Rava is going to start questioning this Kal Vachomer. And it's a little bit complicated, but we're going to follow part by part. Amar Rava, bottom of Lamed Hamud Bet. Lo tehe ritzicha doche korban yachid mi Kal Vachomer. You want to say that Ritzicha is not going to override. In other words, if you say it's not going to override a Korban Sibor, then I'm going to tell you that on that same logic, the also shouldn't override the Korban Yachid. It also shouldn't override individual people's offerings. Now, what basically Rava is going to say is, if it doesn't override communal offerings, which was what you said, Abaye, and I'll take that same Kal Vachomer and I'll prove to you, which we'll have to see in a minute, that it doesn't override individual offerings, then you're stuck, Abaye. Why? Because then the pasuk me'im is b'chita kachenu lamut has nowhere to apply. Abaye's whole thing was we could still apply me'im is b'chita kachenu lamut in individual sacrifices. It just won't override communal sacrifice because those communal sacrifices override Shabbat, which means Ritzicha is not going to override that because again, Ritzicha is all the way at the bottom, but right is under Shabbat. But it will override individual, and then we can both have the Kal Vachomer and have the pasuk. Kal Vachomer applies in one case, the pasuk applies in another. If what Rava is going to prove is that the Kal Vachomer can apply to individual offerings as well, and then we'll say Ritzicha doesn't override communal and it doesn't override individual, and then there's nowhere for the pasuk to go. And if you have a conflict and you have a Kal Vachomer on one hand, and you have a pasuk saying something opposite the Kal Vachomer, what are we going to do? We're obviously going to hold by the pasuk, and then the pasuk's going to apply. Basically, it's going to say in all the cases, and that's where Rav is going to go. Rav is going to say all avoda is overridden by ritzicha, meaning if the Kohen is working in the temple, whether it's communal offerings, whether it's individual offerings, we're going to basically take that Kohen out of the temple and implement the murder verdict, right? The capital punishment. So how does Rava get there? Okay, that was all just what Rava is going to do. But how does Rava get there? Starting from the top of Lamed Vav. My Yom Tov shenitchem mipnei korban yachid ein ritzicha doche oto. Well, he's going to say, well, wait a minute. Yom Tov. On Yom Tov, now, not everyone agrees, but there is an opinion that on Yom Tov, you could bring individual nidarim and nidavot. You promised you were going to bring something to the temple, and you come there for the holidays. Like the general opinion is you do it on the Chol HaMoed. But there is an opinion. It's the way Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar understands Beit Hillel. It's his unique opinion. There's machloket about this in Beitza, that it's nidche because of a korban yachid. I think it's in Beitza. Yeah, it's in Beitza. So it's nidche. Okay, even korban yachid overrides Yom Tov. Well, as soon as you say that, right? So now you say, if that is more important than Yom Tov, right? Then we're going to be back to Abaye's Kavachomer. And then Abaye's Kavachomer is going to apply across the board according to this opinion. So now let's read it inside. So again, we're going to start from the top of the line here. My Yom Tov shenitchem ipnei korban yachid, according to some, okay, ein ritzicha docha ota. So now we're going to say that ritzicha shouldn't override that kind of avoda. Why is that? Because korban yachid shehu dochet Yom Tov ein odin shelo teh ritzicha doche oto. Because again, if this korban yachid overrides Yom Tov, and Yom Tov doesn't override, right? Yom Tov, overpowers Ritzicha, because we don't do it on Yom Tov, then again, your hierarchy is avoda, even individual offerings, is more important than Yom Tov, which is more important than Ritzicha. And then you can't say that Ritzicha is Doche Ota, and then you'd have nowhere for the pasuk to go. So now we're going to say the following. Now, Abaye could work, and the pasuk could apply only to individual offerings if you hold by the other position. Then nidarim and nidavot don't override Yom Tov, and then we can keep that distinction that Abaye made between communal and individual. If you're working on communal offerings, we won't pull you out of the temple. But if you're working on individual offerings, we will, because we can put a voda there at the bottom because it doesn't override Yom Tov. And this is just a review of what we just said. If you hold that nidarim and nidavot can be sacrificed on Yom Tov, then there's nowhere for the pasuk to go. And then we're going to reject this kal vachomer. But Ella Amar Rava basically says, I'm going to reject Abaye even according to both opinions. Okay, I'm going to say, Abaye, you have nowhere to stand. Lo mebaya. Okay, you don't even need to say, meaning it's obvious. Lemanda amarni krivim biyom tov. This is all just reviewing. It's just saying it in different ways, which is now Rava comes and says the following. If you hold nidarim and nidavot override Yom Tov, then of course your kavachomer is out. Because again, your kavachomer gets beaten out by a pasuk that has nowhere to go. If you say individual and communal offerings can both be sacrificed on Yom Tov, then that puts avoda at the very top. And the pasuk says, I don't care if it's at the top, Ritzicha is going to override it, right? And then you can't use your kavachomer. So that for sure. And here the Gemara says it explicitly. I was kind of adding it in before, but now it says it because the pasuk me'im is b'chi would have nowhere to go. So you're definitely wrong according to those who hold nidarim and nidavot krivim b'yom tov. Now, what if you hold they're not krivim b'yom tov? Then theoretically, Abaye has a response. Again, going back to Abaye will say, the kal vachomer applies in communal offerings. There we're going to say Ritzicha does not override. But in individual offerings, we could say me'im is b'chi works in individual offerings. But even that Rav is going to disagree with. If you say that you can't sacrifice them on Yom Tov, and you think then that Abaye's kal vachomer could work, haktiv me'im is b'chi. Now notice, what if you were writing that pasuk, how would you write it? Me'im ha-mizbech, right? Why would you say mizbechi? Mizbechi is God's altar. Why are we calling it God's altar? We could have just called it the altar. Everybody knows what altar we're talking about. So they explain, what does Rava explain? Mizbechi ha-miyuchadli. It's my unique mizbech. What does that mean? Umay nihu, what is that? Tamid. It's the mizbech with the korban tamid on it, the thing that is the most precious to God. And what is that? That is the sacrifice we bring every day. The one we bring every day, that is God's, right? That's nowadays we pray every day. That shows our complete dedication to God, that it's something we do consistently every day, right? If you think about Daf Yomi and consistency every day, that is the power in the consistency, in the everyday, not that special korban you would say, right? Maybe the Yom Kippur korban or something. That was special. No, the most special is the one the Jews do every day. And what does it say? Even from my favorite sacrifice, tikachenu lamu, take the person out. And there goes Rava to prove, okay, besides the whole logic we said, if you say, right, that nidarim and nidavot are krivim b'yom tov, besides that, even if you say they're not krivim b'yom tov, still I have a rejection to Abaye. And then it's obvious from the pasuk again. I don't know, obvious, but he sees obvious from the pasuk that we're talking about even a mizbeach with communal sacrifices on it, and therefore there's no room for the kal vachomer because the pasuk overrides your kal vachomer logic. And that's the end of that whole section. Okay, now moving on to things that are a little bit more simple, not as hard to follow. Dinei mamonot hatumot v'tarot. Okay, now we're back to the Mishnah, which basically says that when it comes to dinei tumot v'tarot, dinei mamonot, we start with the most prominent rabbi, as opposed to dinei nefashot, where we start with the least prominent judge. Okay, rabbi, judge, however you call it. We start with the most prominent. When it comes to dinei mamonot, with dinei nefashot, we start with the least. So let's start with the dinei mamonot. We start from the most important. We're going to have a bit of a problem because something Rav said doesn't seem to jive with this. I'm a Rav. Rav says, I was in the court of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and they started with me in Dina Mamono cases. Now, apparently we're going to see he was the least. Okay, you think Rav was pretty prominent. Certainly compared to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he was not, because in the time, right, once later, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wasn't there. Rav was the greatest Emora. But at the time of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he was not. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was definitely greater than him. So the Gemara asks, but doesn't the Mishnah say we start with the greatest one? So Amar Rabba berei Rava v'itema Rabbi Hillel berei Ravi Valus. Shani minyana debate. Okay, so either Rava, the son of Rava, says it, or that's not the usual Rava, or Rabbi Hillel, the son of Rabbi Valus, says it. Shani minyana debate. Rabbi dekulu minyana minatzad havumatchale. They say Rebbe was a unique exception. Why was Rebbe a unique exception? Because they would always start from the tzad. Now, why is that? So we're going to see in a minute. But Amar Rabba Bered Rava V'item Rabbi Hillel Bered Ravi Balus Miyamot Moshe Va'ad Rebbe Lo Matzinu Torah Udula B'Makom Echad. What was so unique about Rebbe? What was so unique about Rebbe was he had two things going for him. He was both a political leader, okay, which made him really someone individually unique. He was a community leader, and he was also, there's meaning he was a political head. He was a Nasi, and he was also great at Torah. So since the time of Moshe Rabbeinu until this time, we don't have both those things in one person. So now the Gemara says, Vilo, really not? What do you mean? Okay, now we're going to go through history, and we're going to see, is it possible that there was someone who was Gadol, B'Torah, Ugdula, B'Makom Echad? So let's go through our list. Okay, who's first after Moshe? Velo, Vahava Yoshua. What about Yoshua? He was, right? He had both those things going for him. He was a political leader, and he was also, right? He ran the army, right? He was everything. So they say, Hava Elazal. There was also Elazal. In other words, we're looking for someone who was the only person, okay, where that was the only one who was like that. But Elazal, right, was also in that time period. He had the same greatness as Yoshua. Okay, next, Havi Pinchas. What about Pinchas? After Yoshua, right, and after Elazar, Pinchas rules. Havus Kenim. There was Kenim at the time, so it wasn't just him. Okay, Hahava Shaul. Okay, you're getting the hang. We're going to keep saying it was this person, but there was someone else at the same time. Shaul HaMelech, right? He was Shechvo Amala from everybody. He was shoulders above everyone. Nope, there was Shmuel. Okay, Hava Shmuel. Ha Naf Nafshe. But wait, at some point Shmuel died in the time of Shaul. So after Shmuel's death, Shaul was the only one who had this greatness. Kulu Shnei Kamrina. No, we're talking about all the years of someone's life. In other words, we want to find a person who the whole time they were alive, there was nobody else who matched them. Okay, they were unparalleled from the day, I assume they mean from the time they became a leader to the time they were no longer a leader. Okay, Hava David. What about David HaMelech? He was great. Hava Ira Haya'iri. Okay, Ira Haya'iri is a much less known character than all the others that we've been talking about. But he, if you might remember, he comes up, by the way, besides coming up in the Tanakh, he comes up in Tanakh, it's not so clear his greatness, but he comes up in Moed Katan. We talked about him. He was the teacher, the Rav of David HaMelech. So he obviously was greater than him, or at least the same, equal to him in Torah capabilities. He was his teacher. V'hanach nafshe, but at some point he dies. So what are we going to say about that? Well, and again, we're back to our same answer. We're talking about all the years of his life. Okay, Hahava Shlomo, moving on. Shlomo HaMelech, what about him? Shimi ben Gera. Okay, he was apparently his equal also. V'hakatle, but doesn't he kill Shimi ben Gera? Kulu Shnei Ka'amrin. And again, we're talking about while he's ruling, there has to be no one from at any point. Shimi ben Gera was at the beginning of his rule. Hava Chizkiah. What about Chizkiah the Melech? We had a whole story about him recently. Hava Shevna. Exactly that. Remember, there was Chizkiah and his troop, and there was Shevna and his, and Shevna was also very smart and very, a big leader. Okay, the Ha Iktil, but isn't Shevna killed? Remember, that was the whole story we just saw. Kulu Shnei Kamrin. And again, we're finding someone who, at the whole complete time, there isn't an issue. Hava Ezra. Okay, let's go to the next big political leader and Torah scholar, Ezra. So fair, right? It brings the Jews back to Israel. Hava Nehemiah ben Chachelai, right? Remember the Sefer Ezra and Nehemiah, they were both overlapped. Amar, okay, so now we're done. We found nobody from the time of Moshe to Rebbe. Only Rebbe has this greatness. Okay, now the Rav Ava wants to go forward now. Fast forward. How about from the time of Rebbe? So Amar Rav Bar Ava, Afani Omer, Miyamot Rebbe Ad Rav Ashi, Lo Matzinu Torah Gdula B'Makom Echad. The next great leader is Rav Ashi. He's the only one after that has Torah Gdula B'Makom Echad. I want to point out, just in case I wasn't clear, B'Makom Echad means in one place. In other words, in one place you have the greatness. That was the whole thing. In two places, right? You had two leaders at the time. He is the one shining light that is way above and beyond everybody. So now they say V'hava Huna bar Natan, but wait, in Rav Ashi's time there was Huna bar Natan. That's not the usual Rav Huna. There's a different scholar who was also the Reish Galuta. So he had the political, and he was also a big Talmud scholar. So the answer, Huna bar Natan, Mekaf Habakayef Leila Rav Ashi. No, he in the end was under Rav Ashi. Okay, so his greatness, he had to report to Rav Ashi, so he doesn't count. Now, I just want to point out before we move on, because we're done with this section, this was a total aside about who the great leaders were of the Jewish people and where we had someone who was not surpassed by anybody else. And if you notice who's on this list, okay, Moshe Rabbeinu was obvious. And then we have Rebbe and we have Rav Ashi. Now, what makes Rebbe and Rav Ashi unique? And perhaps this is why the Gemara is putting them in this spotlight, because they were the ones who was attributed to them that Rebbe edited the Mishnah and organized it, and Rav Ashi edited the Gemara. And we've seen this before, right? And that puts them in unique positions, different really than anybody else. Dinei nefashot matchilim min hatzad. So now we're up to the next part, which is Dinei nefashot. We start from the less prominent person, right? The least really. And tomorrow's daf, when we get to the next Mishnah, we'll see why exactly it's called from the side. Okay, that we'll have to wait. Where do we get that we start in Dinei Nefashot from the side, from the less prominent rabbi? Amar Rav Acha bar Papa Amar Kra Lo Ta'aneh Al Riv. Okay, this is the pasuk where it talks about Acharei Rabim Lahatot. Okay, and how do they read this word Lo Ta'aneh Al Riv? Lo Ta'aneh Al Rab. Don't answer back to a rabbi, which now it sounds like it's saying you can't disagree with the rabbi. Now you can't. I mean, it's not like you have to vote exactly like your rabbi, but what it means is like the rabbi shouldn't intimidate others. And as we shouldn't have a situation where the more prominent person intimidates someone else, and that's where we learn it from. And that's why we don't want to start with the greater rabbi. We're going to bring a different pasuk. Rabba bar Chana amar Rabbi Yochanan mehacha. Okay, the background to this story is when David HaMelech gets Naval convicted of being a moreh b'malchut, someone who rebelled against the king, it says, "Vayomer David la'anashav chigu ish et charbo." Everybody, get your swords ready. We're gonna kill Naval. Vayachgaru ish et charbo v'yachgor gam David et charbo. Notice they do it first, then he does it, and it seems to be they're learning from here that they first convicted him, and then David decided to convict him, and that David kind of comes in only at the end, even though it's talking about actually the killing of him. Seems to be interpreted here to be about the convicting and not necessarily the killing. Amarav. Okay, so those were two different psukim from where to learn this source. Neither of them, as you can see, is the most convincing, and maybe that's why there's two psukim. Amarav. Now Rav is going to have this halacha that we're going to have some issues with. Shoneh adam letamido v'dan imo b'dinei nefashot. A person can teach their student things. Let's say you have a judge, and the judge teaches the student some things that are relevant to this particular case. like teaches them some halachot that are going to be relevant in implementing them in this particular case. Vidani mobidine nefashot. And then the student can join those judges, be part of the judgment, and it's not a problem that they were influenced by their rabbi. In other words, here you have, again, the greater influencing the less great. And we said in the Mishnah, you can't do that. Or we don't start with the greater one teaching. But if it's not as part of the deliberations, but comes this judge, teaches some things to a student, and then the student sits in the court with the judge, that's fine. So the Gemara says, but wait, we have a Tosefta that contradicts this, right? You can see it's a little different from the Mishnah. But now we're going to have a Tosefta that says this, which says, Hatarot vatumot, ha'avu b'no harav v'talmido monim lahem shnayim. So it doesn't exactly say that they were taught directly this issue, but it's very similar. A father and a son, and a student and his teacher, they usually, one is taught from the other, right? The father teaches the son, the Rav teaches the student. And they say here, when it comes to Tum and Tara, they can sit on a court together and they can count as two opinions. But that's only in Tum and Tara. When it comes to, this is Tosefta in Sanhedrin, Perek Zayin. Dinei mamonot, dinei nefashot, dinei makot, kiddush hachodesh v'yibur shana, but in monetary law, capital cases, makot lashes, kiddush hachodesh determining the new moon, and determining do we need to intercalate the year. Av ubeno harav v'talmido ein monim lahem ela echad. We cannot count them as two different votes. Okay, this goes across the board in all sorts of things. Like I'll just give you an example: manuscripts. Okay, when you're trying to determine what's the best manuscript, and do we have, let's say, a majority? Most of the manuscripts have this text, and the minority have those. I remember learning in university, like you have to track which manuscript was based on which manuscript, because if this manuscript was based on that one, we don't count that as two. That counts as one because the source is all the same. So when it comes to all these other things besides determining whether something is pure or impure, you can't count a father and a son as two votes. They count as one vote because they only have, right? They're all, it's coming from the same opinion. So how did Rav say that the teacher can teach his student something and then the two of them could sit on court and count as two votes? It goes directly against the Tosefta. To which we turn now to Amabet, Kika Amarav, Kigon Rav Kahana v'Rav Asi. So now the Gemara is going to answer. It really depends on the relationship between the student and the rabbi and what the student needed the rabbi for. So Rav says, I'll give you an example, or the truth is they're saying about Rav, not Rav himself. The Gemara is saying that what Rav meant was students that he had like Rav Kana, Rav Asi. That what was their relationship to Rav? They needed him for the traditions. They counted on Rav to teach them what he learned from his rabbi. But they didn't count on him for their logic. When it came to using their logic, they were very smart on their own, and they came up with their own reasonings. So they could actually rule independently with Rav on a court, because while they had the traditions, their own, right, they would use their own logic to come up with different answers. If there's students who rely on the rabbi to fill in the logic for them, the reasoning, well, then it's all one and the same, and you can't vote two votes separately. Okay, thus ends that section. But before we end, I want to go back to some point that I didn't point out, which is a big problem. I'm sure you were thinking of it. So the discussion really focused on the Rava Talmud. But in there is the father and son. How on earth could a father and son judge together? Aren't we talking about judging? And father and son can't be on a court together. They're krovim. Remember that whole, if you didn't follow all the relatives, you definitely followed the father and son, right? Remember, they weren't even mentioned in the Mishnah because it was so obvious. So what are we talking about? So Tosfot addresses this issue and says, well, Kiddush HaChodesh and Ibor Shana we're talking about for the father and son, because for sure in all the other cases they can't sit together. And it comes out interesting. I don't know if I would have thought this without Tosfot telling me, but that a father and son could be on a court for Ibor Shana or for Kiddush HaChodesh. Okay, they're not considered krovim. They're going to disqualify. I'm not sure why there would be a difference there. Others say that we're talking about in the stages of the deliberations. And that what are we talking about here? We're not talking about they're counted as two in terms of the voting for convict or acquit. We're talking about in the deliberations. Now here it's interesting. So what do we need counts for? Well, when you're listening to the deliberations and trying to think, let's say you're a judge on the panel and you want to think about what do I think, and you hear a father say something and you hear the son say it also, you're not going to say, oh, two people said that. That's more convincing. You shouldn't do that because they both come from the same place. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about in the convincing and when each one individually is thinking about what has been said and how many people think that, and maybe using that as a tool to determine what do I think the truth is, pay attention that if this person says it in the same, right, because they were taught by the other person, then don't count that as true. And then you can obviously have a father and a son there because the son is not a judge necessarily, or the father's not a judge. They're just sitting in the galley. Remember, we learned that you can listen to, right, a Talmud who's sitting there can say something or can't say something, right, depending on which situation is. Remember, we said can't say in a capital case, can't say l'chova, can only say l'schut, right? They took into consideration other people's opinions besides just the judges, and maybe that's what it's talking about. Okay, moving on. Amar Rabbi Avaw, asara dvarim yesh bein dinei mamonot ledinei nefashot. Okay, he gives a number. There's 10 differences between capital law and monetary law, as, right, we had the whole list in the Mishnah. Okay, if you want, while I'm speaking, you can go back and start counting and see, because there's going to be a whole question about this count. V'kulan ein nohagim b'shor haniskal, chutz me'eschrim b'shlosha. Now, the shor haniskal, let's go back. What's the case? A shor kills a person, an ox. So the owner is supposed to get killed, but doesn't get killed, remember, because the Torah says, well, we can put a ransom payment and you can pay your way out of the death penalty. But then we say that that it is judged, it's a judge in a court of 23, even though it's not capital crime. We're killing an animal, we're not killing a person. So comes Rabbi Avaw when he says, well, it's in a court of 23, it doesn't have all the other details about all the differences between capital cases and monetary cases. In the end, it's a monetary case. It's judged like a monetary case other than the 23 issue. Okay, that's it. Meaningless. So where do we get this from? How do you know that you don't judge this in a court of that it doesn't have all the other criteria of dinei nefashot? Now it's logical, right? Because why would it have dinei nefashot if it's not capital? Now, again, it's a little tricky because it is 23, so it is somewhat judged like capital crime, but not. There was something in my head that I wanted to say earlier. I'm just thinking what it was. Oh, I know what I wanted to say that I forgot to say. I was waiting for the end of the sugya and then I forgot. So I'm just going back to something entirely different. It just came into my head. This whole idea of me'ingless and that we end up with Rava saying we're gonna take him out of the temple. What I wanted to just mention at the end is that you can see why Rava had an agenda to say this, because it would be crazy to think that you have someone who should get capital punishment. That's why I started thinking about it, because of capital punishment, who should get killed in court, and yet he's doing the avoda in the temple, right? Like, what a crazy thing. You have a Kohen who's standing as the representative of the Jewish people and doing their sacrifices, whether it's individual or whether it's communal, it doesn't really matter. In the end, this person is deserving the death penalty. Who wants somebody like that doing our sacrifices? So the logic, the idea behind it, besides, it took a lot of tedious technical details to get there, but the idea behind it, I think, is very clear and obvious that we don't want this person in the temple, right? It's almost like, and that's why maybe the pasuk says me'im bechi. This is a person that does not belong on my mizbeach. God is saying it's almost like a mitzvah haba ba'avera, right? In fact, if you remember the whole sugya of mitzvah haba ba'avera, that someone's doing a mitzvah by like stole a lulav, the whole source for stealing a lulav and how God doesn't want that comes from the sacrifices of like, if you do. You steal a sacrifice and bring it to the temple. What kind of a sacrifice is that? Kind of similar thing. If there's a murderer who's sacrificing is the representative doing it. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. Sorry, I forgot then, and I'm going back to it now. Okay, back to our topic. So Rabbi Avaw basically said the shor haniskal is a unique exception to all these rules because it, has the 23. It doesn't have all the other criteria of dinei nefashot. Now we want to know meaningless. Where do we get this from? Amar Rav Acha bar Papa da Amar Kra lo tateh mishpat evyoncha berivo. What does this mean? Lo tateh mishpat evyoncha berivo. So lo tateh means don't do it by majority. You need a majority of 2. If you remember, you need to convict someone in a capital case. You need a majority of 2, whereas in a monetary case you only need 1. So now they're going to darshan here. It's specifically evyoncha, the poor among you. Now it's not just the poor; it's anybody. But the drasha is mishpat evyoncha yatamate, right? You can't do it by a majority of 1. You need a majority of 2. But avalatamate mishpat shel shor niskal. But it's coming to exclude a different case where it's not a human and it's an animal. Then we can go by a majority of 1, and from there we get to all the others. It's not going to have that criteria. It's not going to have any of the criteria of capital punishment. Now the Gemara is going to deal with the numbers. Asara, hatisha ahavu. Okay, go count in the Mishnah and see. So the Gemara claims right now that it's 9 and not 10. I don't know if anyone checked. You want to write to me in the chat if you counted. Well, the Gemara says, what do you mean it's 9? Why is that? That's not a question. Ha asara katani. It really does say 10 in the Mishnah. So I don't know why you're having a problem with his 10 number when it actually has 10 in the Mishnah. See, now I got you guys going. See some books flipping. Mishum de ein hakol ksherim ve'esrim v'shlosha chadihi. So what does the Gemara answer? No, no, no. It really is 10, but it's 9 really. Because, and that's why they're going to question Rabbi Abaye, because it really seems like 9, because, and you might find this surprising, but the fact that everyone can do dinei mamonot, including people who are psule yuchsin, but they can't do it in a capital crime, is the same as 23. Okay, this is a little complicated. Why are those the same as 23? Well, the point is that there's cases that need 23, and then you need a higher level judge. And there's cases that need 3 only, and then you can have any judge, even if they're psul yuchsin. So as soon as you take it out of the, once you say there's this difference, 323, it's basically the same thing as saying, not a mamzer, not a ger, which we're going to get to, those disqualifications. Yes, in 20 and in 3, not in 23. And they think that they come from the same place. Okay, that's as far as I can explain. It's a little hard to explain exactly why they're viewed as one, but it seems like one comes from the other. Okay, so we've whittled it down to 9, and that raised our question, how did he say 10? To which the Gemara answers, ha'ikach rite. Well, there is another one. It's just not in the Mishnah. Where is it? Tosefta. D'Tanya, it says in the Tosefta, ein moshivim b'Sanhedrin zakein b'saris, u'misha ein lo banim. It is a bit of a difficult halacha to understand. You can understand at a very basic level. It's a little bit offensive to people who don't have children. What it's saying is people who have children have more sensitivity, and not only people who have children, because it puts the zakein in here, people who have the ability to give birth to children, okay, as opposed to someone who's already past the age where they can have children. It's interesting because zakein has children already, and don't you usually think of judges as kenim? So it's a little bit strange if you think about, the high courts in most countries. They're usually older people who don't have young children. It takes a long time to get to that position. It's a bit of a strange halacha. I'm going to have to kind of leave it with a lot of questions. So basically, it's saying here that if you are an elderly person or a person who can't have children anymore, or you're a person who is a saris who never had the ability to have children, then we're going to say you can't be a judge. Rabbi Yehuda, or you don't have children for whatever reason, Rabbi Yehuda Mosif Af Achzari, says also a person who is known to just have no sympathy. Okay, the idea is that we need, and maybe you can understand it at least this way, you need the maximum amount of sympathy possible. Because again, this goes back to the agenda. The agenda is we want to make sure that people come out innocent. And the more compassionate you are, the more you're going to go in that direction. And then the idea here is that having children makes you more compassionate. Okay, take it or leave it. Hard to say. I mean, I think it's true that children do make you more compassionate. To say that there's people who don't have children don't have compassion, I think is a complicated thing to say, and I think it's very unfair. Okay, notice, by the way, it's not in the Mishnah, it is in the Tosefta. Rabbi Yehuda, in others, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi didn't add this one to the Mishnah, so that might make us feel better. So now they say, we're going to keep going back to the same thing, which is chilufehen b'mesi. Now the difference is that this is all opposite in the Mesi case, which is in a Mesi case, anyone can testify. Why is that? To Rahmana Amar, lo tachbo v'lo tchaseh. There we don't need this compassion because the Torah says, don't be compassionate. Don't have any sympathy for this person. And therefore, anyone can judge in a Mesi case. Next section. So that was all about the 10, right? In other words, again, his whole point was about the Shor HaNiskal, but we got sidetracked and hung up on his number 10 and then checking the Mishnah. Okay, and are there really 10? Are there really 9? What about the 10th? How do we get it? Okay. I see, Terry, you said you only counted 9, so we'll have to go back after class and look over carefully. Okay. So now, what does it mean everyone can do dinei mamonot? And then we said not everyone can do dinei nefashot. So who are we excluding from dinei nefashot and including that they can be a judge in a dinei mamonot case? Rabbi Yehuda latuye mamzer. It's to include a mamzer. Okay, a mamzer has an issue because lo yavo b'kal Hashem, right? They can't be part of the Kal Hashem, so they also don't let him be a judge in a case of 23, in a court of 23. But in a court of 3, he can judge. These are going to be in the category, and we might remember this all from Kiddushin, of psule yuchsin, people who have problems with their yichus. Okay, they're not part of the regular community for various reasons. Okay, some more on the outs, some less on the outs. But when it comes to judging, we're not going to allow a mamzer. To which the Gemara says, wait, if Rav Yehuda is getting that from our Mishnah, from the word hakol, right? Everyone can do dinei mamonot, even though they can't do dinei nefashot. Who is that, including the mamzer? Well, hachanina chadazimna, that was already taught from a different Mishnah in Nida, the Mishnah we quoted earlier. Kol right? We had this on Kaf Zayin Amud Bet. כל הראוי לדון דיני נפשות, ראוי לדון דיני ממונות. ויש ראוי לדון דיני ממונות, ואין ראוי לדון דיני נפשות. It already comes out of that Mishnah. That Mishnah says, everyone who can do dinei nefashot, who can be a judge in a case of capital cases, obviously can be a judge in a monetary case. But there's some people who can be judge in a monetary case and can't be in a capital case. And Havina Bala Tuyamai, and they ask, what does that come to include? And the same Rav Yehuda says, V'amar Rav Yehuda La Tuyamamzir. So why does Rav Yehuda say that Mishnah includes a mamzer and this Mishnah includes a mamzer? Once you get it from one Mishnah, you don't need it from the other. So the answer, really, you got Rav Yehuda wrong. Chadalatu ger v'chadalatu mamzer. We have 2 Mishnayot. One is including the ger, a convert can judge in a monetary case, not in a capital case, and chadalatu mamzer, and one comes to include a mamzer. So tzricha. Now the question is, why do you need both? Well, a ger can marry anyone other than, right? A gior can't marry a kohen, but otherwise a ger can marry anyone in Kal Hashem, right? They don't have problems of, a ger can't marry, a convert can't marry someone. Again, limited. The gioret, there's a problem with a gioret and a kohen, but other than that, a ger can marry someone. So you might say, of a mamzer imalo. The fact that the ger can judge a monetary case doesn't necessarily mean a mamzer can, because a mamzer can't marry anyone, so maybe that would make them more disqualified. Maybe you'd say a mamzer because a mamzer has 2 Jewish parents. But a ger doesn't have Jewish parents, or one of the parents isn't Jewish, right? The mother's not Jewish. Then you might say no, tzricha, and that's why you need both. And that teaches you that both of them can judge monetary cases, but they can't judge capital cases. Now, there's all other things besides monetary and capital. There was an issue in America that came up not so long ago about a convert who was a judge and was on a conversion panel of judges. And some people made a big issue about it, right? And this is not a clear-cut situation because they don't discuss, can you be a judge in a case of conversion court? So that's a whole interesting question in of itself, not mentioned here explicitly. Okay, and hakol ksherim ladun dinei nefashot. Okay, in general, I just want to point out here that when we talk about judges, like there's a bunch of sugyot that are complicated. Like it does seem a little unfair. Why can't a convert be a judge, right? And just like, or why can't someone who doesn't have children be a judge? You know, they've come up with these categories. They're very general categories and exclusionary. So sometimes that's not so easy for us to say, but we want to accept everybody in and not make all these gradations. But you could see how they're trying to preserve the court system by, again, in their mind, excluding was a good thing to keep it make sure that everything was, done the way they want, or I don't know, but something to keep in mind. My time. Okay, so now why? Now we want to know really. Okay, it seems the Gemara also wants to know what's wrong with the mamzer and a ger in terms of them being a judge. Where do we get that from? So Rav Yosef brings this bride to kashem shebeitim minukim b'tzedek, just like they're clean when it comes to righteousness, everything has to be done just right. Kach minukim mikol mum. They also have to be clean of any blemishes. Okay, anything that you might think also part of the issue might be that there's something of the way we talk about the court, the way people dress in the court. There's a certain standard because we want everyone to respect the court, and it could be that they were concerned that if there were people who psul yuchsin. Okay, even though we should be nice to them and we should be inclusive, we just know that people don't all feel that way, right? There's people in the community that will say, oh, this person is a mamzer, even though it's a terrible thing to do. But when we have a court, we have to worry because if people start pulling down the court and saying, oh, the court has all sorts of judges that we don't respect. It's the same way we had the Kohen Gadol has to be wealthy. Like, what do you mean the Kohen Gadol has to be wealthy or has to dress nicely, right? Why do we care about the externals? And there's all these things in the temple that were beautiful because we want people to feel like they have respect for the place. If there's garbage around and it's met right, people will walk in and say, "Oh, what a place! This is a dumping ground." So again, it could be that this related to the feelings of some people, not all people, and not to say that that's justified, but we want to create a scenario where we don't have issues of people saying, "Oh, look, you don't belong here," and we don't believe the system. There's a constant need to uphold the respect of the court because in the end, right, if we're saying God is the ultimate ruler, then a court is, we can say, oh, you could be doing the wrong thing in the eyes of God. So any chance we have of somebody raising any issues with that, well, okay, maybe we should avoid that from happening so that people, there was always a concern of zilzul, of disregarding things the court said. Okay, so now we say that's why, and that's why I was thinking about here, because minukimi komu, we don't want to mum at all. Same thing, we don't want mumim in the temple. We don't want, right? These are places that have to be preserved in its perfect form, even though it's exclusionary and it doesn't sound right to us. So Amar Meimer, Mikra, what's the pasuk? Kulach yafarayati mum ein bach. So here we have a pasuk from Shir Shirim, which seems to be usually Shir Shirim we understand is an allegory for the Jewish people and God. You're completely beautiful. You don't have any blemish. Now they say, what do you mean? If we understand blemish to be psul yuchsin, there's lots of Jews with psul yuchsin. There's mamzerim around. There's gerim around. It's just not true. So they say this must be talking about judges. And we have to have one area where mum ein bach, and that would be by judges. But the Gemara is going to reject this, and they say Dilma mum mamash. Maybe they really mean a blemish, like a physical blemish, and not a psul yuchsin. So let's try a different pasuk. We're going to have 3 attempts here. This is when Moshe takes the 70 zkenim, and they say they will stand there with you. Okay, so now with you, this is in Bamidbar Yud Aleph. Imach b'domim lecha. They have to be like you, like you. With you means like you. And Moshe didn't have a psul yuchsin, right? He had no problem with his lineage. So, okay. And now the Gemara says, but that's not judges. What were the Shivim Zkenim? And now it's very interesting. Until now, we talked about the Shivim Zkenim, and we talked about the setup that Yitro suggested. We kind of put them all in one lump group. But now we're going to distinguish. So you say, no, that was for Shechina. Those were prophets, those 70 Zkenim. They were getting prophecy. And here we go back to this big distinction always between prophets and judges, right? And Chachamim. The Chacham and the Navi are very different. Prophecy is something different, right? You need the presence of God to rest upon you. Maybe then you need to be without any flawed lineage. This is in Yitro when he suggests to Moshe to set up a court system. There it's a court system. He's not talking about prophets. And itach b'domim lecha lehave. Okay, with you, meaning they need to be like you. Okay, new Mishnah. We'll just start this Mishnah today. Sanhedrin aitach kechatzi goren agula. It was a semicircle, like a threshing floor in the shape of a semicircle. Kadesh uroim zed said we want all the judges to see each other and to see all the witnesses. It's like an amphitheater type of thing. Ushne sofrei dayanim omdim lefnehem. There's 2 sofrim. This we read already a few times. Echam yamin, echam mismol. So one on the right and one on the left of all the judges. Vekotvim divrei mechavim divrei mezakim. And they write all the things that everybody said, the ones who think to convict, the ones who think guilty, they write down the deliberations. Rabbi Yehuda has a different opinion. Rabbi Yehuda omer shlosha, we need 3 sofrim. Echad kotev divrei mezakin, echad kotev divrei mechayvim. So one writes all the people who want to acquit, one writes all the people who want to convict. V'ashlishi kotev divrei mezakim v'divrei mechayvim. And then we have, just as a backup to make sure we're writing this correctly, we have a third person who's writing both of them. And then we can check. I don't know, there's no majority here, like how we check if there's one person wrote one and one person wrote the other, but I guess it's just a way to ensure that we make sure there aren't mistakes in the transcriptions. You see how important these transcriptions were, which is very interesting. Okay, end of today's stuff. We're going to review. We started with Abaye, with Rava. We reviewed Abaye and then Rava, who rejects Abaye in terms of Abaye wanted to say maybe we pull you out of the temple only if you're doing individual sacrifices and not communal, to which Rava definitely completely rejected what he said. Then we moved to the issue of starting with the Gadol. From that, we got into Rav, who wasn't the Gadol, and yet they started with him when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was the Gadol, and that's because he was unique. And then we talked about his uniqueness, and we tried to find, was there really nobody between that time and that time? And in the end, we conclude there wasn't. And then we talked about Rav Ashi, who was like him. Then we get to Dinei Nefasha Matchilim Min Atzad, and where we get that from, that in Dinei Nefasha, we need to either Lotan Al Riv or from David HaMelech. from there, we got to the statement of Rav that you can have a teacher teach a student, and then the student can be a unique opinion. How does that work with the Tosefta, which seems to say otherwise? We have the resolution of, depends on what kind of student. Then we had Rabbi Yavaw, who said, sure, and Iskal is only 23 and not all the other 10 differences. 10, aren't there 9? And then we said, no, there's a 10th from somewhere else. And then said maybe there really were 10 in the Mishnah, but we count them as 9. We have to go back now and count because Terry said she only found 9. So I don't know. We'll go back and look at that. And then Akol Kshavim Ladun Dinei Mamonot, but not Nefashot. And who does that include? We had the Ger and the Mamzer because we had 2 Mishnayot in each one something. Why do we need to teach each one? Because each one has something unique that you would have thought you couldn't learn one from the other. And then we get to why. Where do we get that a psul in Yuchsin is going to be a problem? A flawed lineage is a problem. And we had to go through 3 different psukim till we saw that in the end we learned it from Moshe and the judges that Yitro suggests he set up. And then we talked about the formation of the Sanhedrin and how many scribes there were. And we saw a machloket about that. With that, we finished today's daf. Wishing everybody a great day.